Welcome. I know a lot of you are going to be trickling in over lunch. I'll try to wake you up from the lull a little bit. I'm not making any promises. But my name's Andrew Maar. I head up research and strategy at the Center for the Edge. The Center for the Edge is on the edge of a large consulting company, Deloitte. And what we do is focus on the edges of technology, of business, of changing needs in the marketplace, because we think if we can identify the edges, whether they're demographic edges or what have you, that we're going to have insight into the patterns that are going to be the source of major opportunities coming forward. So in that context, we focus on issues that are not yet on the CEO's agenda, but ought to be. And in that context, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the long-term shifts that we see in the marketplace, the ways in which we see the world changing, and what that means for the opportunities ahead. If you think about it in terms of how we got to where we are in the large companies that exist today, scalable efficiency has been the name of the game for a long time. It's what's allowed our organizations to get to where they are. And the first push around scalable efficiency occurred with what is called Taylorism, which was this effort to define and tightly specify all the little tasks within a process to make that process as effective and efficient as possible. And then in the 80s and 90s, we had something called business process reengineering. And that took the business world by storm. And there, the goal was to move beyond these individual tasks to focus on the end-to-end process view. Let's get that end-to-end process view looking as good as possible. But both approaches focused on operational efficiency. And both approaches assumed that workers were more or less homogeneous, that they could fit into the task at hand, regardless of context. And so, for more than 100 years, companies grew larger and larger by becoming more efficient. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this quote from Henry Ford, that any customer can have any car painted any color so long as it's black. But perhaps what's less familiar is why he picked black. Black, it turns out, was the only color that could dry quickly enough to achieve Henry Ford's production goals. So it wasn't a function of aesthetics. And scalable efficiency doesn't just demand conformity of the people who work within the institution. Scalable efficiency demands conformity amongst those it serves. It assumes that customers will settle for standardized products, and that's the path to scalable efficiency. So for a long period of time, since 1965 to today, at least based on our analysis as part of some work we've done called the Shift Index, this approach has yielded some significant results. Labor productivity has doubled since 1965. But when you look at it in the context of an environment that's changing exponentially, it's just a shadow of what's possible, a tiny fraction of what ought to be possible, given the capabilities made available to us through this technology. Today, we have new sources of value, new ways of scaling, and we're just at the beginning of it all. But the way that we have worked in large organizations have not kept up. And it's a crime because we spend more than half of our lives living in and working within large organizations. And we're failing to fulfill our full potential. And so this is a key driver of some of the change that we see in the world. And one of the reasons we think there's going to be a big shift that's required going forward. And so given this change, this uncertainty, this pressure that we're all experiencing, we ask the question, how are companies doing? How are companies doing with all the technology, this amazing technology that's made available to them? And we didn't look at just the most recent quarter or even the most recent decade. We looked at all public companies. And if you take profitability, firm profitability, as a measure of success, and we used our return on assets as our measure, it's not a perfect measure, but we think it's pretty good. As labor productivity more than doubled, our return on assets has declined by 70% across all public companies here in the US, not just a subset. And you'd think with this technology, we'd be more productive and we'd be getting higher and higher returns on what we have. It's simply not the case. And it's been a long and sustained erosion, and there's no sign of it leveling off, let alone turning around. So we're not just running faster and faster and staying in the same place. We're running faster and faster and falling further and further behind. And this is just one indicator of the pressure. For the companies that are still around, and many of you are likely aware, over the past 80 years, the corporate life expectancy on the S&P 500 has declined by 80%. So the question is, what's holding us back? Well, the top right, where challenges are known and solutions are certain, is where most large companies like to live. And in that world, employees who break the rules or break the process are assumed to be in error and need correcting, or deviant and deserving punishment. This is where scalable efficiency models thrive, this top right box. And the temptation is to make it as big as possible, when in reality, it's shrinking. The thing is as we move into a world that's more rapidly changing, what matters is constantly changing. What we know at any point in time rapidly diminishes in value, and exceptions to the rule increasingly become the rule. And the risk, as Tim Cook puts it, is not that machines end up thinking like humans, it's that humans end up thinking like machines. And we would take it even one step further to suggest this is not even a future risk. Humans have been thinking like machines for the past century. It's been drilled into us. Be reliable. Be predictable. Check the box. Be a machine. Get the job done. By the way, along the way, don't mess it up. And so this is the challenge. Scalable efficiency works best in a world that's not rapidly changing. Today, consumers are less willing to settle for the standardized products that drove success of the large organizations in the past. And as the gap grows between what we expect and what we want, the trust that we place in institutions to meet our needs slowly erodes. And in the face of this exponential change, we need to fundamentally reject these old models and move towards new models that allow us to learn faster. Because if we're not learning faster in a world that's rapidly changing, we're going to continue to fall further and further behind. Now, just to clarify what we mean by scalable learning, because it can be misunderstood oftentimes, we're not talking about learning for learning's sake, but learning as a means to achieve higher and higher levels of performance over time. We're not talking about methods of knowledge management and new ways of sharing existing knowledge. We're talking about new ways of creating new knowledge to solve new problems. And certainly, we're not talking about formal training programs that are best suited to focus on routine problem sets and more suitable for less rapidly changing environments. Our sense is that the most powerful learning and effective learning occurs day to day on the job, where the unexpected challenges and opportunities first appear. And so for us, given this technology is improving exponentially, sure, agility, sensing and responding in the moment to the uncertainty that's right in front of you is important. But in our mind, it's not sufficient. In this kind of world, the key question becomes, how can we get better faster in a world that's more rapidly changing? And the only way to close the gap is if we accelerate our performance improvement over time, to create more value versus just being flexible in the moment. And our belief is that as the world becomes more uncertain and more volatile, that the front line becomes more important, because that's where the action will be. That's where the practices that could have the greatest impact in terms of addressing the unforeseen situations will be first crafted. Now, I know, and in our sense, is if we could identify those practices at the front lines, that we could provide the basis for extraordinary learning and growth. To echo something that was said earlier this morning, we need to be, and it's similar to what General Stanley McChrystal says, we need to push the decision-making out to the edges of the organization, because that's where we're going to be running into these problems first. But JSOC was one of many groups that we had the privilege of connecting with over the past several months. Over time, we looked across a wide variety of rapidly evolving arenas, from high-tech airline network operations control centers to low-tech disaster recovery operations where cell phone signal can be hard to come by, to elite units within the Federal Reserve and the FDNY, to places like teams that are operating in massively multiplayer online gaming environments like League of Legends. We looked at startups like Away. We looked at corporate giants like GE. And here's just a sampling of the geographic territory that we covered. And I'll just mention that as we looked at these work groups, we weren't focused on work groups that were just high-performing. We were looking at the subset of work groups that are actually accelerating their performance improvement. Because our sense was that the high-performing work groups will have a tendency to just stick with what works. It'll put you in a tendency to be trapped by that scalable efficiency model because you figured it out. Now it's just a question of doing things better and faster and cheaper. But why deviate, right? So they end up tending to be focused on performance in the moment versus improving performance over time. And we were interested in not just one-time performance improvements, but consistent performance improvements over time. And the surprising thing was, as we engaged with these organizations in an effort to find these work groups that were getting better, faster over time, they all acknowledged that the work groups were critical to their success, absolutely critical. But yet not a single one managed performance at the work group level. All of them either managed performance at the department level or the individual level. As productive and effective and as impactful as these work groups may have been and continue to be in these organizations, they were basically invisible from a metric standpoint. So fortunately, we did find a few pockets within these organizations where performance was measured, and we identified 9 practices that help work groups get better faster over time. And I'll just here talk about a few of the key themes. One of the work groups we talked to was at Southwest, within their Network Operations Command, otherwise known as the NOC. They literally run the network in a bunker 24/7. Now, the folks here are in constant contact with the airline pilots in the air and on the ground. They're in contact with air traffic control, and they're the ones who are making the decisions. Do we keep you on the tarmac? Do we delay the flight? Do we cancel the flight? Do we send you home? They're the ones making those decisions. And this group was charged with improving Southwest's on-time performance amongst unpredictable events that disrupted their normal course of operations. And while the results speak for themselves, within 2 years, on-time performance during extreme winter storms increased 200%, while delays over 2 hours declined by 95%. And you could say, well, the easy way to do this is to just cancel all the flights. They did this while canceling 900 fewer flights. So then the question is, well, how did they do this? What was behind their success? And one of the keys to their success was celebrating exceptions rather than trying to avoid them or hide them. It's easy to hide behind process and protocol and say, well, we followed the rules and the rules got us to where we are. It's not our problem. What they did was they saw exceptions as an opportunity to get better at something they couldn't anticipate. Another work group we talked to was at Away. And Jen, who spoke earlier, and Steph, her co-founder, are both Warby Parker alums. And one of the things that was key to their success, which may seem countercultural to a lot of organizations, is that they actively cultivated friction, but productive friction. In fact, Steph said, if you had a company that eliminated friction, it would just produce mediocre products. In their minds, everything the company had done of value was a function of friction. And but if you think about it in terms of what happens in large companies, you get all this diversity around the table. Sometimes it's even celebrated, and then you insist that everybody nods their head in approval when the proposal is put on the table. What's just happened? You've lost the benefit of that diversity. So many big companies try to eliminate friction at all costs. They want diversity, but they demand conformity. Away cultivates friction. What they recognized was that work groups that go along to get along don't end up getting very far. And this was an important practice for them from the beginning when they launched. And partly as a result, they reached the top-tier percentiles in customer satisfaction from the beginning. And now they continue to use this practice as a way to explore how their operations need to evolve while they're growing at a 5 to 6x clip per year, while maintaining those customer satisfaction levels. GE Appliances was another organization we looked at. And they probably sit on the other side relative to Away. They were struggling to get products to market faster. And it took them 4 years to get a product to market. A year to develop the product, a year to do the product market fit assessment, another year to validate the market because they won't launch a product that won't meet a certain number of thresholds. The market size has to be a certain amount. And then another year to work with the customer channels because they don't sell products directly. So you're looking at 4 years by the time they launch a new product. And you had these people in the core that saying, there's got to be a better way. So they set up a facility outside of the mothership called First Build. And they attracted all the misfits from the core that frustrated, the people who were frustrated with the way things currently operated. And they gave them autonomy to do something different. And part of doing something different involved redefining risk. For First Build, the greatest threat to success was not failure, but failing to act. What they recognized was that what was once high risk is now low risk. And that they couldn't rely on, as small as a group that they were, they couldn't rely on just the engineers that they had to get the job done. So what did they do? They opened up what was previously it was a black box approach to R&D. And they reached outside for ideas. They not only crowdsourced ideas, but if you can believe it, they crowdfunded ideas. You're talking about a major corporation crowdfunding their ideas. 6,000 people gave First Build $2.7 million to build an ice machine that gets delivered in 18 months. To put that in perspective, it's more than Oculus Rift raised on Kickstarter. That's a little different. So in total, in 2 years, this group patented 33 products, brought 8 of them to market, but not all of them were successful. In fact, they proved their value, I think, through their failures. And one of them was a cold brew coffee machine. This is GE Appliances, so they're looking at where's the market going. So they focused on cold brew coffee machine. They developed a cold brew coffee machine that could develop cold brew in 12 minutes rather than 18 hours. Sounds like a pretty good idea, but when they actually took it to the market, the crowd didn't bite. So they pulled it down within 3 weeks. And if you think about what would have happened in the core of GE, this would have been a career-ending situation. failure was not tolerated, especially after you've invested 4 years in product development. If that doesn't sell, it's a problem. And so it was actually quite hard for these folks to stomach the failure given the history. But they eventually grew to view it as a signal of their strength. And in 2 short years, just to put it in perspective, they reduced the time it took to develop a product from 4 years to 4 months, and the cost it took to develop a product from $4 million to $40,000. And as a result, gained a lot of room to experiment. So risk in this world is a little bit different than it used to be. So if I've convinced you that some of the practices of the work groups on the front lines will be increasingly important to driving performance at the organization overall, the question is, how do we move forward? Where do we go from here? How do we get started? Do we redesign all the work groups within our organizations? Probably not. But at the Center for the Edge, one of the things we believe is that small moves, smartly made, can set big things in motion. So start with small moves, make them smartly. And in this context, one of the things about smartness is, where can you achieve the greatest impact with the fewest resources? So find the work groups on the front line whose performance is going to disproportionately drive performance at the operating metric level, which is in turn going to drive performance, financial performance, for their overall company. If you could accelerate performance at that level, you're going to build a groundswell of support and interest in terms of what you did, and you'll have done it with relatively modest resources and effort. And part of it is starting with the metrics that really matter. So if you start with the high-level financial metrics and you say, okay, what's the challenge there? Maybe it's revenue growth. And you say, okay, let's drill down one more level at the operating level. What's behind the challenge of revenue growth? Well, we're losing customers at a rapid rate. Our churn rate is pretty high. Okay, let's go to the front line. What metric is disproportionately driving the churn rate of our customers? And someone on the front line says, well, when the customers call into our call centers, they call in, we're not doing an effective job at dealing with their problems. When they come in, they get frustrated, they leave. Okay, well, now you've got to focus to say, if I could innovate on how to more effectively respond to customer needs within our call centers, I could have a big impact in terms of the overall financial performance of the company. You've just earned the attention and respect at all levels of the company by focusing on the metrics that really matter. So, this accelerating gap between technological infrastructure and business performance is part of what we see as both the opportunity and the imperative ahead of us. That if we don't find a way to accelerate our performance improvement and we just stick with this linear improvement over time, not only are we going to leave a lot of money on the table, but we're going to leave ourselves vulnerable to somebody who does. But if we get our work environments right and the business practices right, we could have a significant opportunity ahead. That the key is for our practices to catch up with the technology. And here it's important that technology and practice are intimately linked. As new technology platforms evolve, so do new practices. And in a world of scalable efficiency, what we have defined is something that is so tightly specified, so tightly integrated, so standardized, that it's precisely the kind of work that is subject to automation. And indeed, companies have invested huge sums in automating existing processes, eliminating people where possible, instead of focusing on how we can explore these new tools and technologies to amplify and extend the business practices of the people that are left. And our belief is if we take these tools, like Slack, seriously, and these practices seriously, to redefine work away from the processes that hold us back towards work that's more suitable for humans, work that involves creativity, our imagination, that allows us to capture the full potential of our social and emotional intelligence, that ultimately, for the first time, we have the ability to unleash an increasing returns curve, where the more people that join together, the more value we can create together. And as we explore that potential, perhaps we can even shift the conversation away from things like AI and even intelligence augmentation to thinking about how humans can augment humans. And if we work this way, we have an opportunity not only to restore some of our humanity, but to express more of our individuality and achieve more of our potential and far greater impact. Thank you.